Hi, ladies. It is Jenny Cokerts, and I'm excited about our interview with a writer for this month. Um, I've got Annette Newcomb. Is that how you pronounce your name, Annette?
Yes,
Perfect.
exactly.
So thank you so much, Annette, for taking this time this afternoon to chat with me and to chat with our Flourish Writers community. And you actually reached out to us and shared your book, a little more about your book with us, and we're going to talk about it in a minute, when we started talking about Flourish Writers, because this book, you're the author of your book called Hanging On to Hope, and it's a book that's very close to your heart because it's your personal story. And it's a hard story, but it's very much a God story, and I can't wait for you to share some of that story with our ladies. But you know what I loved? I was reading, I got the book on Kindle, and I was reading it, and I love that at the beginning you thank your husband, because he was like the one that really said, you need to share this story. And I love that because that's what we're all about here. Like, that is our hearts behind Flourish Writers, is the value in our stories, even when they're really, really hard. And you've got a lot going on in your story, but it's such a it's a beautifully told story. But before we get into that, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, I became a Christian when I was 16, going to church that my parents, I didn't grow up going to church, but my dad at like 14 is like, we're going to church. And I was like, so thankfully for him and his influence, I became a Christian when I was 16. And then my husband Adam, have been married next week. We'll be married 33 years minus one, which we can explain in more detail in a minute.
Right.
And we have 3 grown sons, Kenny, Brennan, and Tyler. My oldest, Kenny, was married last month, or 2 months ago in June, was married 2 years. And for the past 20 years, I have been very privileged and blessed, I feel, to be able to work at home as a medical transcriptionist. So I was able to have a flexible enough schedule to be able to be involved in my boys' lives, volunteer at school, be there when they got home, be there to take them to soccer, whatever, but still be able to contribute to our family's income and be able to do that. So that was a really great job to have, and I still do it. Like, I started this morning doing it. When we're done with this interview, I'll go back and do it, and so it gives me flexibility. And then recently, as of just 2 years ago, I became a published author. So
I know, and I'm excited to hear. We're going to talk about the writing process, and because I think there's so much, especially as this was your first time writing a book, I'm sure there was so much you learned during this process, and I think it's going to be really great for a lot of the ladies in our community to hear a little bit about that process. But before we get there, so your book, Hanging On to Hope, can you tell us a little bit about what it's about? And it also has a tagline. What's your...
Well, here's a couple.
Show us. Yeah.
My middle son, who's a great artist and graphic artist, actually designed the cover for me. And the tagline on it says, "From marriage to divorce, through depression to remarriage, and what God taught me along the way."
Yeah.
And that's the tagline on the book. The book is actually a memoir of my life. And what prompted me to write it, and as you said earlier, my husband actually prompted me to write it. After 26 years of marriage, my husband and I got divorced. And that set off a very severe depression in me, which I'd never experienced before, that was so severe that I was actually suicidal. And I actually attempted to take my life on more than one occasion. We had no idea what was going on with all that. We thought it was all just as a result of going through the divorce and the separation. But we were actually very fortunate later on to find out a few years down the road that that triggered off a bipolar depression. It wasn't just I was really severely depressed. I was actually grateful to be accurately diagnosed with bipolar depression, bipolar disorder, I'm sorry. And being able to get properly diagnosed so that you're properly on the right medications, because when I was first just given medication for depression, that doesn't treat bipolar disorder. There's a whole nother facet of that that's got to be treated. So a year almost to the day that our divorce was final, my husband and I got remarried through the help of an amazing Christian counselor, and obviously a ton of God's grace and forgiveness. We remarried. And after that, my husband had said to me, you need to tell this story. You've got an amazing story to tell, and it needs to be told. And you need to, there's people out there that need to hear that story. And at that time, I was still not, I hadn't been diagnosed with bipolar yet, and I was still kind of in a depressive kind of state, and I couldn't even think about where would we begin to write this story. But then after we got the correct diagnosis and I was able to kind of get my mind back into a proper place, the Lord allowed me to write this whole story down. And when I started to write it, I realized that I had also been through so many other things in my life before that, that there was kind of this thread of the Lord seeing me through so many difficult things in my life from the time that my husband and I first got married. And when I went through the birth of my first child, we both almost died in the process.
Wow.
And I battled cancer when my children were very little. I got diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and my children were 8, 6, and 10 months at the time that I got that diagnosis. And I lost my father very suddenly and unexpectedly. He had a massive heart attack. And so I thought, oh my gosh, all these things have happened, and yet I've seen the Lord's hand through all of these things. And so I'm fortunate to be, have had worked for a writer, actually, a man that had worked in youth ministry for many years named Jim Burns. He's written tons of youth ministry books and marriage and family books. He has a ministry now through Azusa Pacific University called Homeward. And so I was actually able to meet with him, and he said, try and think of a theme that kind of runs through this entire story. And our family are big movie buffs. We watch lots of movies, and we kind of throw movie lines back and forth in conversation, and that's been part of our family thing. And I happened to be sitting watching Shawshank Redemption, and there was a line at the very end where the lead character talks about hope and how hope is a good thing. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's the thing. That's the thing of this whole story. And so that's how that kind of came about. And it really was the encouragement of my husband to write this down, which I have to give him really all the credit, because when he told me this, I said, well, if I write this all down and tell the whole story, you're not going to look very good through a lot of this story. He said, it doesn't matter. He goes, you have to tell the whole story, because if not, it's like you haven't told the whole truth. You have to tell the whole story.
Yeah.
And so I was like, are you sure? You really? And so he was like, yes. And when I gave him the finished manuscript when it was done, he was okay with it. And so I have to give him really a lot of the credit, because, a lot of, husbands would have been like, I don't want that out there. I don't want it known,
Right.
But he was really okay with that. And I have to give him really a lot of the credit.
And God must have truly been working as well in his heart. And what I find beautiful is because, especially as writers, sometimes when we're telling a story that does involve somebody else as a very big part of the story, I mean, sometimes that's not easy to tell a story. But in your case, God was working in both your hearts, really, so that he was okay with it, and then that you were. So I'm curious to know, have you always enjoyed writing? Are you a journaler? So why write your story? Is it something you process? Did you process a lot of the depression in this season through writing, or you just thought, I just got to tell it and that's the best way to tell it?
I have been a journaler since my kids were born, not so much myself, but since they were born, I kept journals on each one of them. And actually it was the same writer friend who encouraged me to do that when they were first born. When was, you know how like when your kids say something like that's just so precious or so
Yeah.
hilarious and you wish like you would have wrote it down. Well, so from the time they were born, I kept a journal for each one of them, and you would write things like that down, or you would write like really difficult things that they were going through. And so I just kept these journals for them. And it was interesting because as they got older and they would see what I was doing, they're like, well, when are you going to give these to us? You know, and I'd be like, well, I'll know when the right time is for you to have these, you know. And so when my oldest son was getting ready to get married, that was the perfect time. And I wrote like my last entry in his journal and told him like, you know, all the things that I was going to, you know, miss about him being in our home, and, you know, all the just hope that I had for him and his, you know, future life. And I bound them in this really pretty leather box. And I just, you know, that was my gift to him as he was being married. And so, so I've always kind of written like that. And I've always had kind of like an editing ability. Like I have friends that would give me something and say, could you edit this? Or, you know, look, tell me what you think it needs or something like that. So I've always kind of had that sort of ability as well. When I went through my cancer experience, I kept a cancer journal and I kind of journaled that, but it was just kind of for me, you know, I didn't do anything, you know, with it. So I've always kind of journaled in that aspect.
And it's amazing to see when you look back how God sets up even little desires, even things that we're interested in. And there's always such a beautiful purpose. And, you know, when you were talking about the gift that you were able to give your children or your son with this book that you, or this journal you had created, this book, you know, our stories are basically a gift. And also to our own families. I can only imagine what your children, you know, when they got this book in hand and read your story, the good, the bad, and the ugly, what a precious gift to them that is as well.
Yeah. And that was what my husband had said about it. He's like, even if no one even reads this book, it's still like your legacy that you're leaving to our kids. And that was exactly what he had said about it. He was like, you know, and so, exactly what you just said about that.
I want to talk a little bit about the writing process, because I think this is what, you know, is just what we all learn through this process. So when you started, okay, you finally had this aha moment, you know, your husband had been encouraging you to write it. Tell us a little bit of how it felt to just start. Did you just sit down and start writing? Did you go back through some journal entries, or how did you start the process? How did you even know how to compile a book together?
Well, it's funny because I kind of went back to, I had this really great English teacher in 10th grade. It was like my, you know, honors English teacher in 10th grade. And I actually had a flashback to, you know, when she taught you just how to write a paper or an essay. And it was like you get out a piece of paper and you start an outline and you kind of put your ideas down. And so that's what I did. And I actually went before, when you were telling me, I went out and like found the piece of paper.
Wow.
Just wrote, and it was just like a little, you know, piece of paper, but I actually like started an outline, and I was like, okay, I'm going to do an introduction. I'm going to, you know, these are kind of what I have in my mind, like what the chapters would be. And so then I kind of wrote kind of the names and kind of what I thought would be in the chapters. And so then from that point on, it was just a matter of going back and like filling in the chapters.
Right.
And I didn't like it. I ended up, for the most part, staying to the outline, but some of the chapters I, you know, took out, and, you know, some I kind of put in or changed them. But for the most part, I pretty much stuck to the outline that I originally came up with. And that's how I kind of started it. Yeah. And then I found that this was in 2014 when I started the whole writing process. And it took me about 2 years to complete the entire thing. And I was going that summer, my middle son was turning 25, and he was living up in Seattle at the time, and I was going on a trip up to see him. And that's kind of when it started. And I just took like a notebook on the plane, and I just started writing in the notebook. And I just started just writing. And I found that I had to be kind of like away from my everyday what I was doing in order to write. Like I couldn't have done it sitting at home in my dining room table or in my office or whatever. Like I had to get completely kind of away from what I was doing. And it didn't matter if I was around, like it didn't have to be completely quiet or like part of the time I was sitting in the airport and there was all kinds of hustle and bustle
Yeah.
going around, but I was just like, had my earphones on and just sitting there writing.
Yeah.
And then, part of the other time we were up on vacation at my sister-in-law and brother-in-law's house, and we had gone up for a little family vacation, and then my husband and the rest of the family went home, and I just stayed at her dining room table with a laptop and just sat there.
Yeah.
And I finished the last part of it. But I couldn't have done that at home because there would have been too many distractions. But I just got up in the morning and just sat at her table, like literally the entire day, and just, looked at my outline and put everything in and finished it, just typed. And then from that, being in the computer, then I just printed it out like in a notebook,
right,
chapters, and kind of put it together like that. And then it was like the fall of 2015, I think, and my husband and I were at a mental health in the church conference at Saddleback Church in Orange County with Rick Warren, and I talk about that in the book, actually. And my husband, unbeknownst to me, went during that conference and had it like bound in like in a spiral thing. And
right.
It's like, oh my gosh, it's like an actual like manuscript.
Yeah.
Really cool. And this is what I then gave to people that I knew to like proofread it and look at it and tell me what they thought about it, and took it back to Jim Burns, who was a friend of mine who's written probably over 50 books. And, what do you think about it? And I was really surprised when he just looked at me when it wasn't even, actually I gave it to him before it was even complete. And he was like, you're a good writer. And I was like, I mean, coming from someone who's an established, author, written so many books, kind of floored me. But he gave me some really good advice too. And he said, your very first chapter, I would change, or even your first paragraph, because you need to have something that grabs the reader right at the beginning. Like, why would I want to stay and continue to read this book?
Right.
And so, oh, okay. So after you told me that, I changed my first paragraph, and then, and that's really the only thing I changed after I talked to him. But yeah, that's how that process all came about.
So so your husband has the book, the manuscript bound, and you send it off to Jim and to some other friends to read it. I guess you get some affirmation and validation. And then what happens, because I know you got your book published through a division of Zondervan, was it?
It was Thomas Nelson, a division of their self-publishing division called Westbow Press.
Wow, okay.
Jim had actually told me you really only have kind of a couple different options. You can go through a literary agent, hire, and then I didn't even know how much that would cost. He was like, they are kind of like, do whatever they can to get your book out there, because then they make a commission off of how your book does. Or you can just self-publish it through an established publisher, through kind of their self-publishing arm. And if I had to do it over again, because that was actually a pretty costly process, and we were not in a position, like we didn't have a bunch of money saved up to do this, but just like the initial process to do just the very basic, like get it published, get your ISBN number, get, your Library of Congress, the whole 9 yards, was like, I want to say about $3,500.
Wow.
And then they give you like, I don't remember if it was like 50 or 100 actual books. You get it printed.
It's like a package that you purchase.
Yeah, it's like a package. But then there were all these extra things, like if I wanted them to edit it, for them to edit it as opposed to myself or other people, it was like another $1,500. And, it was costly. And then that didn't even include any of the marketing at all. That was just to get it, published. There are other venues, like I think through Amazon, there's something called Create Space, where you do basically the same thing, but then you just kind of print as you go along.
Yeah, the print on demand. Yep.
And it's very less costly to do something like that. So if I had to do it all over again, I would probably do it through something like that. But I also, through the Westbow, got a website through them that I have for the book. So that was, that's kind of cool. And I have about, on the website about the book, about me. I did a speaking engagement, and so I have that on the website.
Mhm.
So there were some perks that came with that package, as well.
Yeah.
But so that's how I went about. And I can't remember how I found them. I don't remember if I just kind of researched different self-publishers, and
Yeah.
that one was connected with Thomas Nelson, and I was familiar with Thomas Nelson,
Right.
just reading other Christian books, and I thought, oh, okay, I'll look into that one, and I
Yeah.
just to go with that one. But yeah, but it's not an inexpensive process to try and do
Right.
on your own. Yeah.
And during the writing process, kind of going back to the writing process, what during that process, like when you were writing some of these stories down, did you find at times that you kind of just there was still more healing to be done? Like, was the writing process of those 2 years as well a healing process from everything that had happened?
I think so. I think it was just getting it all down and writing it all down and seeing it, looking at it. I just kind of was like, wow, like we lived through that. Like we were meeting with the pastor, my high school pastor that I talk about in the first chapters, and I was reading a review that someone had written about the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like so floored, like someone actually thought this about my book. I was so just amazed by it. And he was like, Annette, you didn't just write that, you lived that. And I was like, oh yeah.
Yeah.
I had forgotten for a moment that I had actually lived through all that I had written. And it was just kind of going, wow. I don't know. It's kind of like I'd stepped away from it for a moment.
Right.
Like written it all down, and then you just kind of hope that people would respond to it. But yeah, it was also very, very scary. Like when I had the manuscript, and the very first day that I sent it to Westbow, and I actually had it and I had to push send, I was sitting there going, oh my gosh, like if I do this, then my story is like out there. Like, that people will know that I tried to commit suicide, and people will know that I'm bipolar, and people will know that my husband and I had all these problems and we got divorced. And it was like I just sat there for a moment going, do I really want to hit that button?
Yeah.
It took me like a few minutes to go, and then I hit it and I was like, oh my gosh, like I can't go back now. It's like push the button. And so it was because it wasn't like it was a book about crafting or poetry. I mean, it was my life. And, I had to ask my sons too, like, are you okay if mom puts this story out there? Because then, if your friend reads it or you're someone, they will know this about your mom and your dad. And I have to say, my boys were just incredibly supportive. And they have shared with me that friends of theirs that have read it were incredibly supportive of, because they've just seen, you don't look at that, you look at what the miracles that God did.
Yeah, exactly.
All of that. Like, you don't just see that, you just go, wow, look what God did. It's just, yeah.
So has it been a couple years since you published it?
It was published in the spring of 2016.
Okay, so it's been about a couple years. So what have you seen since then? How has God used this story? And has this kind of set off? Do you do more writing, or do you have a desire to write another book, or is this kind of like I'm good here?
I think my husband tells me all the time, like, when you're writing your next book, and I think it's not like I don't want to write one, but I think I'm just waiting for God to give me what he wants me to write. I don't just want to write for the sake of writing something, but if God chooses to give me something that he wants me to write about, then I would most definitely do that. I really want to, my real heart's desire is to go and speak about the book, because I really want to educate people, and especially in the church, about mental illness and about and just there's been so much even about in the news lately. Like, the only time you hear about mental health spoken is if a famous person commits suicide, or if someone that's not so famous picks up a weapon and kills a bunch of people. And then hearing about people talk about mental illness. And there's just so much more that needs to be talked about. and spoken about, and especially even in the church, because I found when I was going through my process, being a Christian almost makes it worse, because you have people that have this attitude of, well, if you were just praying the right way or reading the right scripture, or if you believed hard enough that God could heal you, then you wouldn't be dealing with these problems. Or there must be some sin that you haven't confessed or dealt with, as to why you're dealing with this. I even had a friend tell me the other day that, the only reason you still have this is because you just haven't accepted God's blessing of healing, and that's why you still have bipolar disorder. And I was just kind of going, I don't know what to do with that, because I feel like, from what I've learned about bipolar disorder over these last few years, is it's something that you're genetically predisposed to have. It's not any different of a disease that if someone has diabetes or heart disease or anything else. And so the fact that God designed me this way, and that I now have this, I believe he's given to me as a vehicle to help other people. And if I believe with all of my heart, if he chooses to heal me, he could do so in the blink of an eye. Absolutely. But in the meantime, he's wanting me to use this in order to bring awareness of mental health to other people, and people in the church to say, you're not, sinning because you're depressed.
Right.
Half of David's Psalms are about when he was depressed, and how God got him through that. And so we need to educate people that for a lot of people, this is a medical neurologic illness that's in their brain. It's not just because need to kick themselves in the rear and get up off the couch and go outside and do something. There's something neurologically wrong that's in their brain that needs to be treated, like any other illness that we talk about. And yet, because there is this whole other side of depression that people can experience, that's very situational. You break up with a boyfriend, you lose a job, you go through a divorce, and you can get depressed, and it's situational, and then time passes and you move on. But there are very other degrees of mental illness that are illnesses that need to be treated as illnesses and looked at that way. And we just don't talk about that enough in the church, educate people. And there's such a stigma about it that people will not talk about it. They will suffer with it, especially in the church, because they don't want anybody to know, because then they'll think, well, something's wrong with me. I'm not praying right. I'm not, reading right. I'm not doing what I'm supposed to do. And so they don't want people to know. And it's so sad to me, because they could be living a very productive, a very full life if they were on the right medication, because they need the medication to get the neurotransmitters in their brain functioning correctly. And so, and then the other whole part of it is the hope that I want to bring to married couples that are just struggling. That's another thing that we don't want to admit when we're at church. We don't want to tell people that our marriage is just hanging on by the thinnest of threads. And so to let people know that, I came from a place that if you would have told me that, I would have wanted to have anything to do with my husband ever again, I would have told you were absolutely nuts. I mean, I would have just been like, I don't have anything to do with this man ever again. And God is a God of miracles. That's what he does. He's in the miracle business. If he had a business card, it would say God, and it would say miracle worker. That's what he does. And I don't believe that there's any marriage that's beyond hope, because that's what he hates divorce, and he wants marriage is supposed to be a picture of God and his church and his bride. And so there's too many, in the church, we've become so lax about divorce, and we have divorce recovery groups instead of marriage
recovery.
You know what I mean? Like helping people in their marriages and just saying, no, I'm not going to let you, call your marriage quits. What can we do to help you?
Right.
How can we come alongside you and not allow this to happen? And we just don't do that enough. And I've just seen God do incredible things in marriages that were just hopeless.
Yeah.
So I'm just really passionate about trying to help people.
And I could definitely hear it as you were sharing how passionate you are, like you said, about kind of sounding this call about mental illness and about restoring marriages to kind of the design that God created it to be. So I am so thankful that you've shared, because these are two such important topics. And I love that you, along with your husband, wrote this book so that you could reach many more women. I really hope that everyone that watches this interview goes and picks up your book. I know it's on Amazon, and so it's easy to get. And because I think this is a great book to share with others as well. Not just those that maybe are going through something similar, but really just a beautiful encouragement on how we can take an ugly story. God can be with us as we write it, and it can impact so many women. So before we close, what encouragement would you give to others that are in the process of writing their stories? And maybe it's not a pretty story.
I would tell them to, well, one, get as many proofreaders as you possibly can.
That's a good idea, yeah.
I actually had several people look at it and then submitted it to them, and then found so many just silly errors afterwards.
Wow, yeah.
That, I mean, I said, I was talking about a prayer closet, and it actually came out player closet. I mean, that was actually what was printed. And I was like, how did this get through like 4 or 5 people and nobody caught this?
Wow, yeah, that's a great advice.
So I had to like do a reprinting, like after I had other people like just really go through it through a fine-tooth comb. So many proofreaders as you possibly can. And if you can, like I was able to seek out other authors, if you know anybody else that has written anything that can take a look at it, because they just have that experience, and they can look at something and just immediately go, you know, have you thought about this? Have you, you know, thought about doing it from this perspective or something like that? Because they just know, and they know what's marketable and what's, you know, what's maybe not marketable, or what would make a better story, you know, how to tell your story a little bit better. I think what you guys are doing is so awesome in doing the writers conference, because that just is so, I mean, if I would have something like that when I, you know, was doing that, would have been so incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
Something like that. And especially because it's not overly expensive. Like we didn't have a bunch of funds when I was doing, you know, to make this happen. And so what you guys are doing is great. But I think just try and, you know, do an overall outline. Just try and get your original thoughts just out, down what you think, an overall picture of what you think you want it to look like.
Right.
And then start, you know, just start filling it in, and just pray. I'm such a huge believer in the power of prayer. And you know, that verse that the Lord builds a house, we labor in vain. And so you just pray over it and you say, Lord, you know, whatever you want to do with this, your will be done with it, whatever you want to do with it. And so, you know.
I love it. Well, thank you. That was great advice. Those were all on point. I love it. Thank you so much, Annette, for your time, for sharing your story, and for sharing about this writing process, because I love getting kind of a behind the scenes look of someone that's gone through the process and what it looked like. And because I think it encourages other writers that this is possible, it can be done, and there's a beautiful reward kind of at the end of the impact that our stories can have. And so I thank you for your time again.
Thank you.